You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on the Old Testament historical books. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders. I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner. Can you give us the Hebrew word of the day?
Yes, and this one I think you're going to really like, Tyler.
Okay.
This one, you know how in the Old Testament, a lot of times you'll hear something like an evil spirit or something like that comes upon Saul. So I wanted to look at that. Yeah, I wanted to look at that a little more. So here we've got this passage here in 1 Samuel where it talks about, and the Spirit of God turned aside from Saul, and then he instead put a spirit, an evil spirit or spirit of evilness or something like that. And the word can mean evil, calamity, bad, misfortune, discouraging, foreboding, something like that.
Yeah.
And then the next verse says, and the servants of Saul, said to him, the spirit of God, an evil spirit of God has come upon you, or something like that, is terrorizing you. Okay. Yeah. So it's linked with God. You can see it in that clearly, verse 15.
Right.
So what I thought I'd do is I'd get some of these other passages. Like here's one in 1 Samuel 16. Well, we just saw that one. Okay, let's go to the next one, Judges. Then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. So when he put an evil spirit between them, so it's like an anger or something bad between them.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in 1 Samuel 16:16, let our Lord now command your servants who are before you. Let them seek a man who is skillful player on the harp, and it shall come about when the evil spirit from God is upon you. He shall play the harp with his hand, and you shall be well. So it must be, here's something that a musician, music will somehow calm this kind of a spirit upon him. So I think it's something like a discouraging spirit or a disappointment or something like that, at least in this context of chapter 16, it seems like. And in the other one, in the Judges passage, it was more like an anger and animosity between these people. So it's not like a special entity or something comes upon him, like an evil spirit, like we think of it. It's more broad than that. And so I think that helps us to understand what's happening then to Saul. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because that's a complication to think of evil coming from God, right?
Yeah.
No, I have two questions for you.
Okay.
Regarding this. One, can you tell us how to pronounce that?
The Ruach.
Yeah.
Ruach Ra'ah. That's that spirit of evilness.
Yeah, because one Ruach is spirit. Is that right?
Yeah. And then Ruach Elohim Ra'ah. So here the spirit of a spirit of God, an evil one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now my second question is, why do you think I'm going to like this word evil?
Oh, because I knew it's kind of a tough issue that people have to deal with, and I thought that would be fun.
That is a good one
to have as a Hebrew word for the day.
Yeah, that's super fascinating.
Yeah. So at least we got this one out of the way, and I thought, you'll like it because it's kind of an issue that we need to talk about. So. Yeah,
that's a complicated one, and that really kind of catches us up. We've already done the first part of 1 Samuel, and in this episode, we're getting into the second part of 1 Samuel, and this is an important section, really, because it's like Saul's fall, basically.
Yep. And here I wanted to show you. I put in this PowerPoint here so you can actually see the structure of where we are. We got through the first two sections last time. Now we're into Saul and David. So we're starting to talk about these two interactions with each other, and so that spirit of evilness coming upon him does make some sense here.
Yeah.
All right. So we keep going?
Yeah, let's get on to it.
All right. David finally reaches the royal court. So that's going to be this, we've got David and Saul that are going to be interacting now quite a bit. And Jesse has already anointed David as king. And yet he can't, he's not actually going to be king yet. So he's been appointed kind of, but God hasn't put him in there yet. And several times David's going to have the chance to kill Saul or do away with him. And he refuses to do it because he's figuring it's God's timing. Let God take care of this and let him take over. So it's kind of neat. David, in my mind, is quite interesting there because he's very committed to letting God take Saul out. And I think that's neat.
Yeah, it is.
Anyway, so we've got the spirit departing from Saul, and so. Remember earlier, Saul had sacrificed, and Samuel told him that because he had done that, God was going to remove the kingship from him.
Right.
So now the events are starting to play out. In chapter 16, verses 13 and 14 says, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose and went to Ramah. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. So there's that passage we just talked about.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, next, David becomes Saul's armor bearer. Verse 21 of chapter 16 says that David came to Saul and attended him, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Now, I suppose you want to know what an armor bearer is, right?
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a special assistant or something like that. Is it like a page, like a knight in his page or something?
I think that'd be a perfect way to say it, a page that, and I assume it helps him put on his armor. It holds his spears and stuff when Saul's not using them and stuff like that. And he probably would be in battle with him so that when he needed his sword or he needed his spear or something like that, he could hand it to him and get him ready. So, yeah. And then chapter 17, we've got the David and Goliath story. And verse 37 says, And David said, The Lord who has delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go and may the Lord be with you. Remember, his brothers had gotten all upset with him for wanting to go to battle. And even Saul gives him his armor and it doesn't even fit him. He can't even carry it. He's a younger child. He couldn't even carry a warrior's armor on him. And so he says, no, I'm not taking that. And he gets these 5 stones and goes out. And then he where this verse comes from, he says, well, when I was out shepherding, I've taken, lions have come and bears have come to take the sheep, and I've fought them off and kept the sheep. So Saul finally agrees and says, okay, go ahead and may the Lord be with you. So that's where that verse fits in.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. And chapter 18 talks about Jonathan and David, how much they love one another. And because of that, Saul gets jealous of David. Verse 7 says, The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. Right. You can imagine it would, right?
Yeah, right.
They just said David is so much better than Saul. So my guess is that this jealousy started there, and now it's going to keep going.
Yeah, it really festers.
Yeah. In chapter 18, you've got Jonathan being David's own family, Saul's own family starts to like David better than him. In chapter 18:1, it says, Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Now that's kind of neat when you think about, here's Jonathan, who would have been the next in line, and David is actually going to take his place. Jonathan's not going to be able to come, take over leadership. Yep. David is, and yet Jonathan still loved him so much. Yeah. So I think that has to be from God and just a knitting of their souls together. And then Michael in chapter 20 or verse in 18 verse 20, it says, Now Michael, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing was agreeable to him. And I don't know if you remember the story, but David is gonna go get. He gives him a gift, almost like a down payment, a dowry, and he goes and kills. I think it's 30 Philistines, and brings the clothes to Saul as a gift.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So anyway, so that's another. So you've got two of his own family members, of Saul's own family members, being taken away from him.
Yeah.
In chapter 20, we've got Jonathan sparing David's life. I don't know if you remember the shooting of the arrow, and David says, if it goes beyond, then that means that Saul's kind of going to come after you. So, and it went beyond. And so Jonathan knew that, or David knew he had to flee. And that's going to be the major, the whole next couple of chapters are going to be David fleeing from Saul.
Right.
All right. In chapter 21, David first flees to the priests in Nob. Nob was probably about no more than 3 miles from Jerusalem, and that's where the priestly cities was. And so David fled there, and he needed help. He didn't have any food and stuff like that because he had to flee from Saul. And so they gave the priest gave him the consecrated bread and Goliath's sword. That consecrated bread is kind of an unusual thing. Jesus even talks about it in the New Testament. Remember, the consecrated bread was only for priests to eat, and apparently when they had to renew it every day. And so after it was a day old, they could then eat it. And apparently that's all the bread they had. So they gave it to David. And then even the New Testament talks about it as being, something that normally you don't do, but if somebody's life is in danger, you go ahead, it's better to do it than to have someone die.
Yeah.
So that must be what's going on here, is they allowed it, even though it was not the thing to do, and these guys weren't priests. The one thing he does say is you got to make sure you haven't had sex with your wife for that, so that make sure you're clean when they do it. And they said they had, and so they got to take it. But that opened up a really sad story. Doeg the Edomite. Now remember, even that it calls him the Edomite, he's now a mercenary from some other, from Moab or Edom, and he's being probably paid to fight for Saul.
Yeah.
So he actually tells Saul about the priests helping him, and Saul goes and kills all the priests except one. Abiathar is the only one that got away, but all the rest of them got killed. Yeah. Now, Saul can't be thinking, right? The only way that they can hear from God, or Saul can hear from God, is if a priest talks to him. And so that's going to cause a real problem later on. He's going to have to use a medium to get information from God. But it was just so stupid of what he's doing there. But it just shows how Saul's going downhill and downhill and downhill.
Yeah.
Yeah. At that point, David flees to Gath, and he has to feign that he's insane to get out of it. It's amazing. Here's a king, one of the kings of the Philistines has got David, one of their major enemies, and he feigns like he's an imbecile or he's mentally challenged, and the king fell for it. In my mind, if you've got a big enemy, my guess is you better know what they look like and be able to distinguish them. Anyway, he gets away. He flees then to what's called the cave of Adullam. And it's at that point that he hears all the priests have been killed. And David says, I knew when I saw that Doeg the Edomite, I should have killed him, because he knew he would tell Saul.
Betray him,
and he sure did. Yeah, betrayed him. Here's a map. This map has got where we think the cave of Adullam is. And today, I think it's what's called the Bell Caves. They are so neat. I don't know if you can see this picture of the Bell Cave there. And these are caves that just go on for miles. I think what happened is they must have been places where they cut out sandstone, because they're sandstone caves, and so they look like big domes on the inside, and on the top you can actually see there are cut marks. So it must have been some kind of quarry or something like that.
Yeah.
But they have like you can go in one cave and there's like 5 offshoots from there, and you can go further in and there's like 5 more. These things go on for miles.
Yeah.
My guess is that would be a perfect place to hide, because here, if Saul came in one of the caves, you got all kinds of ways to get out, and yet you've got a cave that's pretty well protecting you.
Yeah.
Today, these things are a real menace, because what has happened is some of them have, the tops of them, when they got close to the top of the ground, they caved in. And so people have lost their lives walking through the top of those and falling into one of those bell caves.
Oh, yeah. Right.
But for David, that would have been a perfect place to hide, I think.
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway, that's it's kind of neat, and they're really worth going to. So if you get a chance to go to Israel, make sure you see the Bell Caves. Yeah. All right. So David's going to be a fugitive for it, which seems like, we don't actually know how much time it is, but there's going to be several chapters here, like 5 chapters of him fleeing and almost getting caught like 2 or 3 times. Like he goes to a place called Keilah. Keilah is a city that it had gates, it said, and all that. And when David found that when Saul found that David was there, he was all excited, because he thought, oh, great, this is great, because now I can get him. He's boxed in. All I have to do is surround the city, and I've got him. But David, remember I told you that David had Abiathar. That's the only priest that hadn't been killed. And so Abiathar flees and comes to David, and David keeps him as his way to hear from God. Anyway, so Keilah is one place. Saul comes to him there, and he flees. Then he gets to what are called the Ziphites. That is probably another city called Ziph. And he asks God through Abiathar if the men of Keilah are gonna give him up. And so here's verse 5 says this. So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines. He led away their livestock and struck them with great slaughter. Thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. So these guys had actually just been spared. Yeah. Because the Philistines were constantly fighting against them. So David had just spared their lives. And so that, so you would think that they would care enough about him to protect him. So look at verse 12. Then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. Then David and his men, about 600, rose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. It was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah. He gave up his pursuit. Now, this is something that I think is really neat, but I think we need to talk about it. It's called middle knowledge. That middle knowledge is knowing even the potential future. See, in this passage, remember, David asked if the Keilites or the Keilah people of Keilah would give them up. And he says, yes, they will. So they flee. And that means that never happened. Yeah. So God even knows the potential future. Now, this goes back several years ago when we were talking, remember I told you that open theism was a real interesting topic a couple of years ago. Well, here's one that I think is even more important. Not only that God knows the future, but he knows all the possibilities of what can happen. Even if they don't happen, because, there's multiple possibilities, God chooses a certain direction. But that means he even knows what would happen if those the other possible futures could have happened. Yeah. You know what I like about that? So God knows when I mess up, he even knows how to get us out of it, because he knows what would be first of all, he knows the best way to go, which none of us do, right? So he can actually let us know what would be the best way to go, but he can even when we mess up, he can already find the ways to get us out of that. And I actually kind of like that. Yeah. So it's called middle knowledge. And I think in my mind, it's one of the most important things that we should know about God, that he even knows potential future. Yeah. Does that make sense, Tyler?
Yeah, because the complication you're talking about here is that if God says they will surrender you, but then that doesn't actually happen, right?
Right.
Like
Because they left.
There's a tension there. Like, why would wouldn't
Yeah.
that mean that God said something is going to happen that didn't happen?
Yeah.
Unless he's saying it in a way that it's conditional or something.
Well, and that's what it says, because David asks him, will they surrender me? And he says, yes, they will. So then he doesn't do that.
Yeah.
So, does that make sense then?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's a fascinating example of that, I think, in this passage.
Yeah, so I want to make sure you knew that's where middle knowledge actually makes some sense and actually has a passage to help confirm it. Yeah. Okay, David's going to flee again. He goes to En-Gedi. I've got some pictures here of En-Gedi. En-Gedi is just beautiful. It's like it's a valley that has it's basically a river runs through it, and it's not a big river, but it's a decent river that runs through this valley. And on the sides you've got hills, and in the inside you've probably got, usually it's about 20 feet across, maybe 30, 40 feet across, but it's not a big place. And then up on the top, do you see along the top in that middle picture on that slide, there are like caves up there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then also behind the waterfall, there's a cave on that on the far right there. So it's loaded with these, and that's actually going to be really important because Saul's going to go into one of those to relieve himself, and David's men are in the back of the cave. So it was a perfect time. David could have killed him. So here, let's see. Oh, let me first read verse 29 for you. We're in chapter 23 now. Mm-hmm. And David went up from there and stayed in the strongholds of En-Gedi. That's kind of neat. You wouldn't, today it's a nature preserve, so you wouldn't think there's strongholds there, but I think it's a perfect place to hide. And we do know that there's a
stronghold.
Yeah. And there's up on the hill, we do know there was a fort on one of the mountain, one of the hills up there outside of this valley. On the one side, there is a fort. So I'm assuming it was a perfect spot, not only to hide, but also to defend. Anyway, okay, so he called it the strongholds of En-Gedi. And then verse 5 in chapter 24 says, and it came about afterwards that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. Now remember, Saul had gone in to go to the bathroom, and he cuts off a little of his robe. Now, then verse 6 says, so he said to his men, far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. So see, several times he's making it real clear. God has called Saul, and until God takes him away, I don't get a chance to be king. Even though he's anointed at this point, he can't take him out until God does it. So that's going to happen later, but
it's pretty amazing the patience and the trust that David is showing in God here.
Yeah. And imagine, it's got to be hard to know that God's called you to be king, and you have to wait. And who knows how long it was. It was several years at least that he has to wait until God takes him out of the way.
Well, and I think on a personal side too, David has every reason justification, I think, to try to kill Saul, not just for the throne, but because Saul's coming after him. You could characterize it as a defensive move, and still he gives up that justification and says, I'll wait till God settles this.
Yeah. I like that. All right. Okay. In chapter 25, you've got Samuel's death. Verse 1 says, then Samuel died, and all Israel gathered together and mourned for him, and buried him at his house in Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. So that's down in the Negev desert, and he was there. And in verse 20 or chapter 25, then goes on and talks about Nabal and Abigail. Nabal, his name means fool. Verse 3 says, now the man's name was Nabal, fool, and his wife's name was Abigail. And the woman was intelligent and beautiful in appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his dealings, and he was a Calebite. You remember Caleb was one of the people that had come into the land, and he had told him that he was one of them that had given a positive report that they should go into the land. So God gave him a special amount of land. Remember when they came in?
Yeah.
The problem was that this Nabal doesn't. I think that's put in there because he doesn't model Caleb at all. He was a harsh man, and David had actually spared his flocks and stuff like that. And my guess is it was understandable that you would then give him some of the earnings because they had kept your sheep and stuff protected, and he refused to do it. So in actual fact, Abigail goes and gets 2 donkey loads of food and bread and drink and stuff like that and takes it to David. And David says, had you not done that, Nabal would have been dead today. And so he makes it real clear he was going after him. It says that just a few days after that, I can't remember how many, but just a few days after it, God smote Nabal and he died.
Right.
And David goes and gets Abigail as one of his wives.
Right.
So not only was she beautiful, but she was smart too, apparently. All right. Then in chapter 6, we've got David sparing Saul again. Verse 9 says, and David said to Abishag, this is funny. Poor Abishag, several times he's a warrior. He's ready to kill Saul, and several times he said, it's time now to get him. And God says, and David says, nope, not yet. And then even Shimei, I don't remember. Do you know later on Shimei is going to come back and curse David when David is fleeing the city, and it's Abishag that says, Abishai that says, "Oh, now surely he should be killed." And David says, "No, don't kill him today." I'm going, oh wow, poor guy. All right, so here's what it says in verse 9. But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt?" And David also said, "As the Lord lives, surely the Lord will strike him, or his day will come that he dies, and he will go down into battle and perish." Or he will go down into battle and perish. So David knows that at some point God's going to take care of him and get him out of the way. He knows that has to be true, right? Because God's already anointed him to be king. So at some point he's got to get Saul out of there. So. Again, though, it reminds us about David's patience and just waiting until God moves him on.
Yeah.
All right. In chapter 27, David says, I've had enough. If I continue to stay in Israel, at some point, Saul's going to catch us. So in verse 1 says, then David said to himself, now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape to the land of the Philistines. Saul then will despair of searching for me anymore in all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand. You know, Saul would be silly to head into the Philistines, right?
Yeah.
So David knows that's a perfect place for him to hide because Saul will never come there. Yeah. Their greatest enemy, and to go into their hands would be just silly. So, So chapter 27, and then you've got all the. David is going to talk to the king of Gath, and the king of Gath is going to buy the story and continue to protect him, and realizing that he knows that Saul's after him. That's why he's fleeing. So he figures, kind of thing, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Sure,
so, So for David, he knows that Saul's his biggest enemy. So he's gonna give him a chance to stay with him. So
there's a lot of sense in that. I mean, it's a bit of a risk, but I mean, it makes sense. I mean, maybe there's a thought of, if I support this new potential ruler, he'll be an ally. We won't be fighting with Israel. He'll be, under me or something like that.
Yeah. I'm sure that's what was going on. In chapter 28, Saul has to use the medium. Remember, because he had killed off all the priests to find out.
Huge mistake.
And then in chapter 29, that's when David is going to go fight with the Israelites. The Philistines are going after to battle with Saul.
Yeah.
And so they everybody who's being protected by them needs to go to battle. But the Philistines are thinking, man, we don't want David on one side of us and Saul on the other side. They'll get us in the middle and wipe us out. So even though the one king did trust him, the rest of them didn't. And so they sent David home. Or sent back to where he was. And I'm actually so glad that happened. I think that had to be from God. Imagine if David would have had to go against his own people. Then later, when he comes back to be their king, nobody's going to trust him. Yeah. Right. So I think that was from God. On his way back in chapter 30, he heads back home, and the Amalekites had stolen his property and his wives and all that. So he had to go down, defeat them, and then free his wives and his family and stuff like that. And remember those Amalekites, if Saul would have wiped them out, they would have never had all these problems that we're having with them now.
Right.
So this one's going to cost David quite a bit.
Yeah.
All right, now we're at chapter 31. We're at the very end of the book of 1 Samuel. And at that point, Saul and David are both going to be killed on Mount Gilboa. And I've got a picture there of, you can see the mountain on the right there. That's Mount Gilboa. And then basically what they're going to do is they're going to take Jonathan and Saul's body and put them on the walls of Bashan. Yeah. It's kind of thing to mock the defeated foe and stuff like that. So it was basically to mock them into to almost like saying, here, we can do this to you. And so
yeah, right.
Yeah, so so anyway, here's what verse 12 says. All the valiant men arose and walked all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from off the walls of Bashan, and they came to Jabesh Gilead and burned them there. So what I wanted you to see, here's the map down here. So Bethshemesh is about right there, where that arrow is pointing. And Jabesh Gilead, notice it's on the other side of the Jordan. Yeah. So they came marching all night, it says, came and got the bodies and then took them back. Now it says they burned them there, but that must have been the normal way to honor a person that after they had died. Yeah. So that's basically what happened. Later on, David is going to honor those men for doing that, but at this point, that's basically what happens.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal.
Yeah. Okay, you ready for some questions?
I'm ready.
Okay, all right. Why did David refuse to kill King Saul?
I think the ultimate reason is he trusts God. But I think part of that trust too is a knowledge David has that like there could be consequences for killing the Lord's anointed. And he still sees Saul as having been anointed and being the legitimate leader, legitimate king of Israel.
And imagine if he's that careful with Saul, hopefully the people will be that careful with David when he becomes king. Right. So he's the Lord anointed. Maybe they'll use his example not to harm David. So all kinds of wise things there. Yeah. Was it wrong for David to lie to the priests at Nob?
My goodness, what a question.
Sorry.
I would imagine perhaps this kind of falls in that idea of like shrewdness. So maybe it's kind of being a bit, kind of like wise with what you say to accomplish a good end point.
Okay.
Do you buy that?
Okay, hang on. The next one is real similar. Was it wrong for David to pretend to be mentally challenged in Gaza?
Wow. In today's world, definitely. That's a cancelable offense.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting one too. Yeah. I think that probably fits in the same thing. There's kind of a shrewdness to it and kind of like survival.
Okay, here's what I'm going to argue that it's like the greater of two evil, or the lesser of two evils, or the greater good. The idea here that the greater good, especially on pretending to be mentally challenged, is he was going to kill David. So rather than because one of God's greatest commandments is don't kill each other, right? So so the idea of he doesn't. Well, he actually lies by his actions, right? So to lie rather than to have somebody be killed, that's a greater or lesser evil kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Same with the priest at Nob. My guess is that had David not lied to those priests at Nob, then Saul would have come and killed him.
Yeah.
And so all his men would have been killed. So
Yeah.
I've actually argued that the greater good or the lesser evil is what there are going to be times when we have to decide what choices are we going to make and how will we make those choices. And the choice could be between two very bad things. So you have to choose the lesser of two evils. Now, you remember the story about Corrie ten Boom, how she hid the Jewish people under the table,
Right.
but was under the floor under the table, and some Nazis or some Nazis had come in and said, do you have any people here? Now she had or Jews here. You have a choice. You can either say yes or no, right? She actually said yes. And she said, they're under the table. And they looked under the table and they weren't there and they laughed and thought it was a joke.
Right.
But she could have also said no and spared them maybe that way too. So it seems like to me, you've got a choice to make when you've got two bad options. You've got to make the choice that you feel is less bad, I guess. Yeah. And that's what I think is happening here. And that's how I would argue the greater good or the lesser evil kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now remember, that's not giving us a license to lie.
Yeah. Right.
But it's because it's only going to be a very few times when it's, you've got two bad options. Yeah. We used to, I was terrible. We used to play with Wayne Grudem because, pick on him. He would actually argue, it's never right to lie. And I understand what he's meaning. But then we would say, okay, when you go out on Friday night, you leave the lights on, so that if anybody was going to steal your stuff, they're going to think somebody's home. Isn't that basically a lie?
It's pretty good, and I hadn't considered that.
Yeah. Anyway, all right. Okay. Number 4. Yeah. Why is it important to understand middle knowledge?
Yeah. Well, like that statement could really, the statement that you brought up, that verse where God kind of says they are going to betray you, basically, like they'll turn you in. That you have to somehow contextualize that theologically, right? Because if God knows all things, like there, you potentially have some kind of weird conflict there if it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
God said something, this is going to happen, and it doesn't happen. You could avoid what God says. So like you need to have some kind of squaring with like God's omnipotence and his omniscience, with things that he says could happen, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And in that passage, it was very clear. They were asking, potentially, would this happen? And God said, yes, that will potentially happen. So they didn't do it, and it didn't ever happen. But what I like about that is that means God knows every possibility for our lives, and he knows what's the best one for us to choose.
Yeah.
And can help us, guide us in that best one.
Yeah.
I really like that. I think that gives me a lot of assurance as to, God can take care of us in any situation. So I like that. All right. If David had already been anointed to be king, why did he not just take over the throne of Israel?
Yeah, that one's kind of complicated, I think. I think there's a practical reason to not do it because kind of like you said at the beginning, whenever I answered the first question, like if David sets an example of killing the king, whenever like that, then you're just setting up the next, that's how you become king. You just kill the king in front of you, basically. Yeah. So I think there's a practical thing of like, you have to build up your followers and, earn the trust of the people, do all these things to actually be a good leader or then not be, just betrayed by the next person who wants to be king.
I think what you said also earlier was really important. It's teaching David patience.
Yeah.
And trust.
And trusting God, right?
Yeah, if he actually believes that God is going to protect him and wants to have him be king next, then he can just wait because he knows it's going to happen. It'll just be a matter of time. But my next question kind of goes along with that. What did David learn by his fleeing from Saul?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a growing trust in God by having to do this, because you are on you're fighting to survive every single day, basically. There's no guarantees of anything, but God does care for them all the way through it in some really dangerous situations you wouldn't want to be in, like allied with your enemies, just kind of hoping to live, because that's not a that's not the place you want to be, really.
Yeah. All right, I got one more. All right, why would King Saul not search for David among the Philistines?
No, this is one you kind of brought this up, and it did make me. I had an interesting thought about this. I think it's interesting, at least. Okay. I mean, of course, that's a risk. That would be very risky to venture into enemy territory, searching for, maybe what Saul would call as a usurper to the throne or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think what's fascinating about it is all of Saul's all of the time and energy he's expending searching for David anyway is also kind of a bad, irresponsible idea anyway. Like, it's not the most logical thing to be so obsessed with finding David. And I think we see, in the text, that it's driven by jealousy, so there, it wouldn't be that surprising that he would follow him into the land of the Philistines, because that's another bad idea. But he doesn't. So I'm assuming there must be a greater fear there, or some kind of reasonableness that says, like, this is too far. This would definitely end in a bad way for me.
And remember, right at the end of the chapter, chapter 31, the Philistines do destroy Saul and Jonathan and all the, and so we know they were a powerful force. And I think it would just be like committing suicide for Saul, I think.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, that's our time for today. We've gone through basically the second part of that. Actually the third part, where David is interacting with Saul.
Half.
Yeah.
It's about the second half of it, pretty much verse wise, right? It's about the same.
So next week we'll pick it up, and what's going to happen is now we're going to get into David's life. Finally, David becomes king, and you hear all of his life, and that's pretty much what we've got next.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good to me. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you.